Hi and welcome to my first video in this series about energy and ecosystems, and today we're going to be looking at pyramids and also energy and exchange. And so the first section on this topic is to do with the role of autotrophs, and specifically autotrophs are known as producers when we look at food webs or food chains. And so autotrophs produce their own food from sunlight, and so they do this through the process of photosynthesis. And so you're probably all familiar with photosynthesis in plants, and so those are always the first step within any food chain or food web, because they produce or they take in sunlight and they therefore convert that into energy that other organisms can consume. Now, an issue with the energy transfer from here, so obviously the star or the sun produces a huge amount of energy, and so not all of that energy is consumed in photosynthesis, and some of the reasons for that include some of the light is reflected in the plant, and so obviously plants usually appear green, and so what they're doing there is they're reflecting the green light, so they're not using green light to photosynthesize with. Some of the light actually passes straight through the leaf, and so therefore isn't absorbed to be used in photosynthesis. Others doesn't hit the leaf or the chloroplast, it may hit a different organelle and therefore it can't be used. And the majority of the light is absorbed by the atmosphere, so the majority of the light that's reaching the earth is absorbed by the atmosphere and also isn't actually hitting the plant itself, and therefore the amount of energy converted by the plant is very, very small. And so if we now go on to look at some different terms that you might have seen before. So we've looked at autotrophs being plants. We also have a group of organisms called heterotrophs. So autotrophs, they make their own food from sunlight or photosynthesis. Heterotrophs have to consume other organisms, and so there are different types of those. The first one of those is a herbivore, and herbivores simply eat plants, and so the example here is a rabbit eating a carrot. A carnivore only eats other animals, so like a lion. Omnivores can eat both plants and animals, so like humans. Detrivores only feed upon dead material, and you have decomposers, and the decomposers are used to break down organic material, and they're usually microorganisms. That's something you've learned about in the nitrogen and carbon cycle. So from here we can go on to look at the difference between food chains and food webs. So this is an example of a food chain, and you can see here that you have your autotroph, which is the algae which makes its food through photosynthesis, and then you have a series of consumers after this. And so within a food web you can see that the energy or that the material that these organisms are made of is passed on up through the food chain because they're being consumed. And so we refer to these things as consumers. In fact, we can refer to this as zooplankton being our primary consumer, this our secondary, tertiary, quaternary. But essentially you can use these terms on any food chain. A food web is slightly different. The food web shows the interaction between all of the living things within the ecosystem, and so you can see here that you have this is termed as a trophic level, and so if you were looking at this exchange here, this would be our producer and this would be our primary consumer, and so moving from that to that one would be an example of moving from a trophic level. And so you can see here that some organisms feed directly onto the plants and others are then fed upon by other consumers higher up. But a food web essentially shows the interaction between a lot of living things. It is possible for some organisms to occupy one or more trophic levels, as they may consume different organisms within that, and so you don't just have to stick to one being in a specific trophic level if you're looking at a food web. So on this food web we can go on to look at a bit more in detail about some of the interactions that are happening here. So a good example of what I was just saying is this organism here, the clapper rail. Now you can see here that the clapper rail could be considered not only a primary consumer because it eats the plant life here, but a secondary consumer as well because it feeds upon the sandhopper, which is a primary consumer. And so some things within a food web can occupy more than one trophic level. And so now we can go on to look at the different types of pyramids. And so with ecological pyramids there are three major types. The first one is a pyramid of number, which simply states the number of organisms found at each trophic level. The problem with pyramids of numbers is it can be massively skewed, and it doesn't take into account if one of the organisms is a lot bigger than the other. A good example of this is caterpillars, which feed upon trees. Obviously the tree is much bigger than the caterpillar, and therefore the pyramid would be skewed. It would show it very narrow at the bottom, so one tree and thousands upon thousands of caterpillars within the second trophic level. And so another type of pyramid that's slightly better than that is a pyramid of biomass. Now biomass takes into account the living material found at each trophic level. Again, this is better than the pyramid of numbers, and usually it's measured in grams per metre squared. One of the issues with pyramids of biomass is it doesn't always take into account how quickly some organisms reproduce, and again what you can get is a skewed idea and essentially a smaller bottom section on the pyramid. And this is specifically true of organisms within the sea. So organisms that reproduce very rapidly may show a narrower band at the bottom, but because they reproduce in such huge numbers, it doesn't take into account that at the time of sampling. And so not always is the biomass pyramid always the best to use. The one out of the three that is the best is the pyramid of energy. So what the pyramid of energy takes into account is the amount of energy moving between each trophic level. And if you look, a good example to explain why some of the energy is lost between each trophic level, if we look at the eagle and the snake. When the eagle feeds upon the snake, not all of the energy found within the snake is made available to the eagle. Some of it may have been used in respiration and also therefore producing heat. Some of it is lost as feces and urine, and some of the material is left undigested by the predator. So for instance, the eagle wouldn't digest the bones of the snake, and therefore this doesn't show 100% exchange. And usually you can expect the exchange between each trophic level to be at roughly 10%. Now there is a mistake on this diagram here. When you learn about energy pyramids and looking at the unit for energy, it isn't in kilocalories. The unit that we use for this is measured in kilojoules per metre squared per year. If you join me on the next video where we'll be looking at energy transfers.